There was another crash, and I'm sorry, and this was all preceded by the famous limits to growth peak oil forecasts, no longer by Department of Interior experts, but now by a broader spectrum of academics who are forecasting a peak oil. So if we look, this is a highly stylized version of what I think is the pernicious aspect of the oil scarcity syndrome, and that is that the intensity of the interventions has increased. So we have essentially under oil expectation of oil scarcity, we have maximalist foreign policy responses that are quite disconnected from actual market events. And the interventionist policy doesn't really go away in a successive glut. So we have succeedingly more intrusive, more costly interventions over time. The threat to seize Saudi production is succeeded by actual military force projection in 1982. By 1988, a kind of bottom is reached during which the U.S. operates jointly with the Saddam Hussein regime in Iran. And then we come to what I think initiates a brand new period with the First World War, which is permanent U.S. force projection. Now, I don't know how much of this force projection we would call directly attributable to oil, but what I do think is that its cost is not terribly difficult to estimate. So if we don't concern ourselves with whether this is an externality or whether it's a market power effect, which, although I do tend to agree with Dr. Green that it is, this was my estimation of the cost of Persian Gulf force projection, which is in red, growing from 1982 to my last date here is 2007, to be about $500 billion per year, and this is total defense spending. So how over this period? So how did I get here? It won't take much time. The U.S. has had this number of aircraft carriers over the study period from 76 on. It takes 8 of them to project force into the Persian Gulf. It's a big number, but it reflects the amount of time it takes to get there, to come back, for crews to train, etc. And this is the minimum number of carriers that we've had in the Persian Gulf since 1990. So basically, oh, and I should further say that the U.S. never commits ground forces to a combat operation in the absence of an aircraft carrier battle group. So I allocated defense spending with this simple multiplier, that the CVN is aircraft carrier. Aircraft carriers in the Persian or the Arabian Gulf over the total number of aircraft carriers is essentially the opportunity cost, represents an opportunity cost multiplier for U.S. Department of Defense spending. Not to say that the U.S. military would be smaller in the absence of a Persian Gulf mission, but it could do other things. So that's how I reached this conclusion. So because really in the process of exploring these ideas and not really trying to explain them mechanistically, I'm not going to leave you with a concluding slide, but what I do want to point out, I do want to contrast this very great investment in military force projection against what I think is a kind of a shocking absence of domestic insurance on the part of Saudi Arabia in the possibility of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, of course, has been this strategic worry of the United States formally ever since President Carter announced the Carter Doctrine in 1980. So Saudi Arabia has built a pipeline from the oil-producing region on the Arabian Gulf to the Red Sea, partially to cut transportation costs to Europe, but also to provide insurance against the possibility that the Red Sea or that the Persian Gulf might be closed. But it can only export about half of its capacity in that direction. So the Navy Department noticed in 1990, and even before that, Reagan's National Security Council noticed that we could really eliminate this Hormuz constraint with this pipeline. So Saudi Arabia complained that this would be a very expensive thing to do if we're not going to use this. The Reagan administration concluded, therefore, that it was a good thing for us to continue to project force in the region to obviate that problem. So just compare this upgrade cost, which is $2 to $4 billion, against the very high cost for U.S. force projection. Now, I believe that the Saudis understand the market and they understand America far better than we understand ourselves. So the Saudis, the Roa family, I should say, doesn't want to have a large land army, and the U.S. has been willing to supply a kind of external force, kind of external security force for not just Saudi Arabia, but for the smaller countries of the northern, of the border of the Gulf. So that, I think, in a budget-constrained U.S. economy is something that can't continue. So that is the tie-in, really, to OPEC, is that I think the future of permanent U.S. force projection in this region is limited, and that the end will come much as the British departed Aden in the 1970s in a hurry. Departed Aden, I think, in 1967. But it happened of a sudden when it was finally recognized that maybe this wasn't the national security priority that had been imagined. Thank you.
Questions for Dr. Stern? Dr. Kaufman.
I really liked it, but as a former believer in peak oil, I'd like to offer a slight different interpretation of the panic on the other side of the graph that you attribute to peak oil. So
I'm sorry, on the other side of the graph, that.
So you show this curve and you say, ironically, after access is reestablished,
Okay, yeah.
then people start worrying about peak oil. But I would like to argue that in every one of those big events you showed, that really maybe it wasn't worried about peak oil, but what those events demonstrated was the overriding importance of oil to the economy. So in World War I, the U.S. went in as a cavalry nation with a navy powered by coal and no airplanes. At the end of World War I was total internal combustion engines. World War II, Japanese military strategy, German military strategy was about accessing oil supplies and the U.S. trying to keep them away from it. And so that demonstrated to the military the overriding need for oil. And then 71, 73, and 79, 82 demonstrated that these price changes in oil could have huge effects on the U.S. economy. And so, you can't sell it as we need more oil to support ourselves militarily, but maybe you can sell it as peak oil or worrying about access. So.
Well, you're actually quite right. And in fact, the military made precisely those arguments in those intervals. And I'm not to say that, certainly the oil has been necessary. I guess what I would, the bigger question that I'm posing is that the conclusion that the U.S. particularly drew from World War II was that we're Japan. We can be cut off. When geographically and from a market perspective, we were ever less isolated. So the fungibility of the market improved, the geographic diversity of supply improved, and as those things happened, the paranoia went up, not down. So, but you're right on the nose. And I don't know whether they made those arguments because they felt like that was the way to sell it, or that the importance of oil, particularly militarily, I think really accentuated everyone's anxieties.
Stephen.
I would actually argue that coming out of World War II, the military didn't see their own sinking the tankers that supplied Japan, and they defeated Germany by cutting off their access from oil in the Middle East. And because the Germans actually ran out of oil in their last push. And so I think what they were doing is, rather than basing it on their own experience, basing it on what they saw.
Well, then I misspoke if I didn't say exactly what you said, because they drew that conclusion, which was the right one to have drawn. I would just make the same point that I did to Professor Kaufman, and that is that the mistake was to assume that we were Japan. So, and I would further say that the great irony here is that the Chinese basically believe they're Japan, and they're kind of recapitulating all of our maritime supply, or all of our maritime supply anxieties in their kind of hyper-aggressive mercantilistic orientation to oil.
If I could ask one question about just today. It seems like the U.S. military and some of our allies are believers in peak oil. You know, if you're a peak oil believer, the German army has a report out. The peak oil proponents like to cite a long 100-page report about peak oil. The Office of Net Assessment at Department of Defense seems to be interested in the issue, intrigued by it, perhaps arguing that it's for real and we have to take it into our long-term strategic planning. So we seem to be converted, and the American people, it seems to be an increasingly common belief among the American people about peak oil, or among people who care about this issue out in cyberspace and such. So it might seem to imply that far from getting out of Saudi Arabia, we could be doubling down there.
Well, the irony of all this is that whereas I had been a 100% peak oil skeptic maybe 5-6 years ago, I should have to say that I really have an open mind. But you've asked about the U.S. and you know, should we increase our military intervention because of the potentiality for peak oil? But I would also say that the reason
we're doing it, maybe they're completely off base, but we seem to be seeming to maybe believe in it, for better or for worse.
Well, we are recapitulating that period in what I'm calling the scarcity syndrome, in which our assessments increasingly use this language of scarce resources, which is the language of Albert Thayer Mahan from back in the 1880s. The greater, I mean, whatever the resource constraint, and the ability for known reserves to be increased by new technology. I mean, we don't know. I think we're a lot closer to that limit than we were. I see the danger in China reflecting that language, those fears, into their national security planning, because they are, I mean, they're being very aggressive, and their internal resource language, and they're not very secret about it, is really about territorial expansion and territorial expansion into sovereign space of U.S. allies. So the push, I think, is going to come to shove as that new Chinese mercantilist fear interacts with our 150-year-old one, and we'll see what happens. But I'm much more worried about that than I am about peak oil.